Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 110, A Priest Forever. Now, as we start the psalm, and it's going to be a very short one, only 7 verses, we start off mentioning that it's a psalm of David. That's nothing new, but we have to actually mention that because that's alluded to um, time and time again in the New Testament. So I want to underscore that a psalm of David. And that means I think that we're hearing the voice of David as the psalm begins. So that's our superscription. Um, David, is it David as king or David younger? Not going to say. But as the psalm begins now, after the superscription, we have the Lord says to my Lord. And even though, again, this is common knowledge whenever you see the term Lord in all capital letters, that's the translator's way of letting you know that's Yahweh, what we call the tetragrammaton. That's a technical term. Um, and let me just say, very often I pronounce that. I followed the Jewish practice of pronouncing that Adonai, because they like out of their sensibilities to not overuse the name of God. They don't want to take the name of the Lord in vain. But this time I'm going to get away from that because I'm going to have both the word Adonai here, which is the Hebrew word for Lord, as well as the name of God, which is used here. So notice the Lord says to my Lord, and this time it is the term Adonai. And so you have David listening on a conversation, and the Lord, Yahweh, is speaking to David's Lord. Now, if David is the king, I don't think this is Saul here when he was a young fellow. This is David listening into this conversation where the Lord is speaking to David's Lord, and kings don't have a Lord except the Lord. And so you've got one too many lords here, or so you would think. And the New Testament plays this out in a way that we're supposed to understand that David's listening to this conversation, this heavenly conversation between Yahweh, between the Lord and David's Lord, his Adonai, his Lord, and that's, I think, a reference to Jesus. And notice what is being said, sit at my right hand. Now, at the right hand of the Lord, that's going at the right hand of Yahweh, at the right hand of the Lord, that's the place of supreme honor in in all the scriptures, to be at somebody's right hand. And so notice, sit at my right hand, and that's something that's repeated in the New Testament again and again and again. I think of Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, the way it starts off. In many different times and in many different ways, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets, but in these last days has spoken to us by a son. And then you read a little bit further, who sat down at the right hand of God. And so that's well attested to in the New Testament, sitting down at my right hand. And notice there's a phrase here, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Now, the imagery that's used here, and I'm looking at a drawing, this is actually taken from an Assyrian wall painting, so this isn't picturing God. This is picturing the idea of having your foot on somebody else, in this case on the back of their neck. And that was understood until a victory has taken place. Your enemies become, when I say your enemies become a footstool of your feet, that's that they are brought before you and you put your foot on the back of their neck to show I'm the big winner and you're now in subjection to me. You'll remember that in Joshua chapter 10, after the Israelites had won a big victory over this assembly of 5 kings, 5 Canaanite kings that had come against them, that those kings were brought forward, and the Israelites, as they went by, each one would take his foot and put it on the neck of the conquered king. We won, and you're the victory, and you're sharing in the victory. That was the idea here. So that's the same imagery that's here. Not that this is going to be fulfilled in a literal way, where your enemies literally become a footstool of your feet, but it's describing that which is going to be the victory, where Jesus, can I say it this way? Jesus gets the victory. I'm looking at it from a New Testament perspective when I say that. But the psalm continues past verse 1. Verse 2, notice the Lord, and again, this is still Yahweh. The Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion. Now, notice David is writing, and he's writing about the Lord, but now he addresses you You say, well, who's the you? That's not the Lord. And David's still doing the writing. And so I don't think this is necessarily David's strong scepter from Zion. I think, again, this is David's Lord, who elsewhere we find out is really David's son. You say, how can your son be your Lord? Well, that's because the son existed before the Lord and before David. And so notice the Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. That was that's what that was a picture of, putting the foot on the neck of the defeated one. That's the enemies. And notice the rulership is described here. It continues into verse 3. Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power. In holy array, notice your people, your power, in holy array from the womb of the dawn, your youth are to you as the dew. Now, that's an interesting phrase about your youth are to you as the dew. What does that mean? Now, well, think about the dew. It appears on the grass in the early morning. You know, there's a temperature change. It's colder at night, and then that condensation brings forth the dew, which is on the one hand you can see it as well. There's a lot of it. It's not just like a little patch over here. It's all over. But also, there's something about the dew that it seemed to be a bit refreshing, and especially in a dry country like Israel, where they are dependent upon rains, but also they're dependent upon the dew, where it brings life and it brings water to a very dry place. And I think that's all part of this imagery, where your people are going to be part of that victory. Notice they'll volunteer freely in the day of your power, and as the sun comes up, that's the womb of the dawn. Your youth are to you as the dew. That is, your people are there, and maybe it can go either way. Is it because they're numerous, or because they are bringing new vitality, or maybe a little bit of both? But we have here, first of all, the fact of rule. But then we have in verse 3, if I can call it that, and I'm going to just take it from the opening line, the people of rule, both your people and your youth. That's looking at the people that rule with David's Lord. Can I say it that way? Um, because think about it, and when we get to the New Testament, we find out that we are co-heirs with Christ, that we rule with him. Now, we continue into verse 4, and this is the second half of the psalm. We're already halfway through. The Lord, and again, that's Yahweh. We've seen that 3 times where he's mentioned, by name. The Lord has sworn, and when I speak about God swearing, I want to pause for a second and just talk about that term, to swear. The term nishba. And that's actually a nifal. Nifal is, we usually think of it as the nifal as passive tense, but in this case, it's more reflexive, where he's not being sworn. He's doing the swearing. He's binding himself. That is, and it's the nifal of the Hebrew word shavah, which is actually the term for 7. You say, well, wait a second. Is he swearing or is he sevening? And that's a funny way to say that. But let me just say, shavah is the Hebrew word for 7, but when used in the nephal or the hifal stem, hifal is typically causative. When it's used in the nifal, then it has this idea of oath. And so that's not just here. That's everywhere you see it. In fact, I think only one time does Shavah appear not in the nifal or ifal, where it still carries that idea of an oath, and that's somewhere in Ezekiel, like one time. But every other time, this is normal speech. And it reminds me of that story in Genesis chapter, I think it's 23. Don't quote me. It's right around there, 23, 24, where Abraham has been digging wells, and the local Philistine king, they've been having issues about ownership, and he's dug 7 wells, and the 7th well becomes this well, Beer, which is the word for well, and Beersheba or Beersheba. It's the well of the 7. It's the 7th well, but it's also the well of the oath. And it becomes a picture of this, where they swear an oath between each other that this is going to be sort of the place where they bind themselves, and they're not going to fight over wells, and they're not going to fight over water. And so, in a sense, it's that idea of the well of the oath, the well of the seventh. And the idea behind this, and I don't think it's limited to just Hebrew. Actually, from what I hear, that in Homeric Greek, they had borrowed the same expression. Now they're saying it in Greek instead of in Hebrew, but the same expression, to bind something by seven things. And that's the idea of an oath. It's like a sevenfold binding, because the word seven is right in there. That it's not just a promise, not just something that's, I pinky swear or something. This is serious. And so notice the Lord has sworn, and when you swore by something, what you were saying is that the thing by which I swear by, if the oath gets broken, then may that be destroyed. And when you swear an oath, you're swearing your life to something. I tell people this when they have a marriage covenant and they give an oath in marriage, that you're saying by your life or by your death, you promise to take this person as your lawfully wedded spouse, a husband or wife, depending which it is. Um, and that we ought to take our oath seriously, by life or by death, and we ought to. Let me just say, I think we ought to take our marriages seriously too. But here is the Lord who has sworn an oath, and notice, and then you say the rest of it, and will not change his mind. That's just another way of saying he's sworn an oath. And what has he sworn? You are a priest forever. Now, who's the you? Who's it speaking to? This is David listening in, but it's not about David. David isn't a priest. It's David speaking about his Lord, and it's not the Lord. The Lord's not the priest. The Lord is the one that swore that he would be a priest. You are a priest forever. And so this is speaking of David's Lord, speaking of Jesus. But Jesus isn't a regular priest. He's not from the tribe of Levi. He's not a descendant of Aaron. He couldn't be a priest. He's a priest king, but in what way? Notice it's according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, the only other time so far in the Bible at this point that you'd seen the reference to Melchizedek was way back in Genesis chapter 14. And he was only introduced, he wasn't the subject of the entire chapter. That was the big rescue story where Lot and the city of Sodom and some of the other cities of the plains were taken into captivity, and Abraham had gathered his servants, and they had gone on a rescue mission, and they had rescued Lot, and they had rescued the other folks from Sodom. And on his way back, in chapter 14, verse 8 of Genesis, he ran into this priest king by the name of Melchizedek. So this is happening in Abraham's day. He's described as a priest, but also as a king, and he was the king of Jerusalem, king of Salem. That was the old way that they described Jerusalem back then. You can even hear it in the name Jerusalem. But he was also a priest of the Most High God. And that didn't usually happen together, but it did in his case. And we don't know anything about him before that or after that. But he shows up and he meets Abraham, and he's got bread and wine. And I think it's interesting. I read that for years before I finally noticed, wait a minute, bread and wine, where have I heard that before? Think about how Jesus came to his disciples and gave them bread and wine, said, this bread represents my body, and this wine represents my blood, which is shed for you. And so we have a priest/king that has done the same. And in the story, Melchizedek actually gives a blessing to Abraham. You would expect it to go the other way, where Abraham would give a blessing to the people of the land, but instead, this Melchizedek, this priest of the Most High God, gives a blessing to Abraham. And that's the last you ever hear of him, until we get to here in Psalm 110. And this will be further explained when we get to the New Testament, where you have an entire chapter. Now, I'm not going to read that chapter. Well, yeah, I'll leave that to you for some other time. But Hebrews chapter 7 gives an explanation and connects this to Jesus. So I'm not just doing this on my own. Hebrews chapter 7 walks you through that entire passage and connects it to the point that we have we have a great high priest, greater than high priest than Aaron and his priesthood, an older high priest that has interceded on our behalf. Now the passage continues. Again, notice we have the Lord, but this time, notice it's not in all capital letters. That's the translators telling us that this isn't Yahweh, that this is Adonai. We're back to just the Lord, and that's, and notice the Lord is at your right hand. And that brings up the question when we talk about the Lord is at your right hand. Wait a second. We saw the Lord, we saw Yahweh saying to David's Lord, sit at my right hand. And so when we look at this, here, this Lord is at your right hand. Well, who's the you and who's the Lord? And remember, David's the one speaking, so he doesn't say it's at my right hand. He's still speaking about, it sounds like two other individuals, or, the Lord and David's Lord. And is this a sense where we're at the right hand of God? Well, in Psalm 109, verse 6, this was the previous psalm, we'd had on the negative sense, we'd had the enemies of David having the enemy, the Satan, actually it was the word Satan, but it uses a title there, not necessarily the devil. But had been sort of a curse. May the bad one, your enemy, be at your right hand, like to do bad things to you. But here we had in chapter here in chapter 110, verse 1, we had sit at my right hand. So how is this working? Some folks take this. This is Yahweh, even though a different term has been used. And maybe it is, or maybe it's, notice you have sitting at your right hand, he's at your right hand. Maybe this is the one that was called to sit at the right hand of Yahweh. And notice the further description of him. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge among the nations. He will fill them with corpses. He will shatter the chief men over a broad country. So what's happening is we're seeing this one who's at your right hand, who's, is this talking about Yahweh, or is this talking about the Son? But he's doing the judgment. He's doing the shattering. He's doing the filling them with corpses. He's shattering the chief men. He's winning. And you say, well, who's winning? Is it the Father or is it the Son? And my answer is sort of yes, that he is winning. But notice how we get to verse 7. And so we have the Lord judging in this. And you say, well, which Lord? And I'm just going to say yes. I'm not going to try to unravel that. But verse 7, he will drink from the brook by the wayside. Therefore, he will lift up his head. And I look at that, and that doesn't really sound like Yahweh. Now the picture is of the conquering one, the commander, the king, who goes and wins. He shatters kings, he judges the nations, he shatters the chief men, and then can I say it this way? Maybe he has the idea of taking a break. Although it doesn't say that, so I don't want to read too much into it, and pausing and drinking from the brook, because shattering and judging and filling with corpses, that's hard work. So he pauses and takes a drink, and then he lifts his head. And that's an interesting picture there at the end. Now, I want to look at the whole thing, go back, and yes, you've got the pause to drink. I want to go back now, and in the first three verses, we had where the Lord said to my Lord, Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And then you have this picture of the scepter extended from Zion, where the people volunteer and they're strong and they're like the dew, or they're numerous and they're like the dew, however you take that expression. And so that's the kingship picture. And then in verses 4 through 7, we have the priestly picture where Yahweh swears. Now he said it in verse 1, but now he swears, you are a priest forever. So now it's the priestly picture, but it's the priest king who is still involved in that combat where the Lord is at your right hand and he judges and he drinks and he lifts his head. And as I say that about drinking and lifting his head, um, I'm reminded about how he spoke about the cup from which he must drink. Now, that wasn't the language of a brook, it was a cup. But he drank, and in a sense, he crossed over the brook. And now I can take that really literally. Where remember after the Last Supper, that Jesus takes his disciples and he takes them on a walk to a place called Gethsemane. Well, to get to Gethsemane, you have to cross a literal brook. There's a brook called the Kidron. It's a valley, and water flows through that area. And he crossed the brook. Now it doesn't say he drank it, so I don't want to put too much into that. But he crossed over that place where he would be arrested, where he would go to his trials and his death and his burial, and he drinks, but so that he could lift his head. Without the death and the burial, you can't have a resurrection, and you can't have a seated at the right hand of the Father. And so it all comes together in this prophecy as we look at what Christ did for us. He conquered, he drank from death so that we can drink from life. We come together and we eat and drink of his body and his blood as we observe the Lord's table, as we observe the Lord's supper, which is a picture of our faith, which is how we entered into that which he has accomplished for us.